Hey, we continue in 2 Samuel 15 today as David and his entourage engage in their stately departure from Jerusalem, seeming to take plenty of time, although Absalom and all the people of Israel are about to chase them down all the way across the Jordan River. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, in the introductory video to this unit, 2 Samuel 14 to 18, I went over some of these elements of style and these interpretive options and the shape of the scene. I won't go over those now, but I really encourage you to take a look at the introductory video and the earlier videos where I especially focused on the range of interpretive options, although it doesn't come up quite so much in our immediate scene today. So we've also been looking at how the story contains an enormous number of characters and places, and we certainly see that today with two new characters, Abiathar and Zadok, and we see them down here. The purple ones are the people around David, and the green ones are the people around Absalom. And it certainly seems that there's more around David, but as I've been noting, these are often individuals, whereas Absalom has on his side all Israel and other groups of people. So Absalom certainly outnumbers David, but David's group, as we've been seeing, is not nationalistic or patriotic in the modern sense, but simply loyal to David. And we saw that last time as he made sure that Ittai the Gittite, someone who could easily have been loyal to the Philistines of his hometown of Gath, was loyal to David. And once getting that oath, Ittai is now with him. And now the scene shifts and the question of the ark arises. The ark, we need to note that although I've been arguing throughout this series that we can read this text as in the final version that we have as if it's all from one author at the time of the succession, there are certainly individual verses here and there that suggest they've been added later. And this is one of them around the question of the Levites and the ark. Because I'll show you in just a moment, and you can see from my note down below, there's only one other reference to the Levites in the entire books of Samuel. And in the summary of David's officials in 2 Samuel 8, that included Abiathar and Abimelech, Zadok and Abimelech, the son of Abiathar, as priests, Levites are not mentioned. So let's look for a moment at Levites with the ark in the Bible. And we'll note that there's only one reference in the Torah before Deuteronomy, and only one in Deuteronomy. But plainly we can hear in the voice of Moses in Numbers, their responsibility was to be the ark, along with the table, the lampstands, the altars, the vessels of the sanctuary with which the priests minister. And so, in many ways, they're like altar servers. They're responsible for the material elements of worship of Yahweh, as opposed to the priests who actually offer that. But we only hear that in this passage in Numbers. It's certainly, as most scholars would agree, from a later post-exilic context. And we can see that as we'll see it below in the context of Chronicles. So we see this one reference here near the very end of Deuteronomy. Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark, notice it's a given there, to take the book of the law, Deuteronomy, and put it beside the ark. This is almost certainly from the time of Josiah, and we can see it in the last reference down here from late 2 Chronicles, we hear Josiah specifically speaking to the Levites. Although in 2 Kings 23, when Josiah's so-called reform is described and narrated, we don't hear about the Levites there. So we saw in 1 Samuel, after the birth of Samuel's story there with Eli, the priest, we saw after that the ark went on its own journey. And when it returns, the Levites took down the ark of Yahweh and the box that was inside it with the covenant, and then set them upon a large stone. Then we have our immediate scene here. So there's nothing about the ark or Levites together all the way back from 1 Samuel 6 till now. Then there's only one reference in the entire books of King, and this is in the ceremony that initiates the temple in Jerusalem under Solomon, of course. So here, the Levites brought the ark and the tent of meeting and all the holy vessels. And this reference in 1 Kings is virtually identical to a reference in 2 Chronicles 15, which I didn't reproduce here because it's basically the same. But then all the other references to Chronicles. And by all measures, the book of Chronicles is a post-exilic rewriting of the history in the framework of having the temple in Jerusalem being the key element of all of creation. So Chronicles starts with the narration of Genesis 1's narration of creation, and then jumps right into this. And it leaves out battles and all the bad things we've been looking at, like Uriah and Bathsheba, and makes David simply a faithful representative of Yahweh to establish worship on the basis of his son building the temple in Jerusalem. And there's no argument that Chronicles is a post-exilic document. Perhaps in the same situation as Ezra Nehemiah, the document that justifies the Persian control of the new built Jerusalem. But as I wrote in my book, Come Out My People, and many scholars who are more expert in Chronicles than I am would argue that although it's from that time, it offers a little different viewpoint among the various arguments for how the post-exilic community should be reshaped. But plainly, this is after the fact. And what I'd like to suggest is the authors of Chronicles have inserted the verse we're looking at here because it's so consistent with what we see repeatedly in Chronicles. So we see about bringing the ark up there, and this is near the very beginning of David's reign. Then a chapter later, when David built houses for himself, notice the plural there, he prepared a place for the ark of Yahweh and pitched a tent in it. But no one but the Levites were to carry the ark. And then later in the chapter, we see some of the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, and the Levites by name, and said, you are heads of the families of the Levites. So there's much more about the Levites there. A little later in the same chapter, we hear the conclusion that God helped the Levites who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh. Notice Elohim helped the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, and they sacrificed animals there. But all the Levites were carrying the Ark. Notice it suggests all of them, and yet in some of the situations there are hundreds or thousands of them. So certainly noting they were collectively engaged in that. In the next chapter, we hear David appointed certain of the Levites as ministers before the Ark of Yahweh. Why some of them and not all of them, you'd have to study Chronicles to look at. Near the end of First Chronicles, we see David assembled all the leaders of Israel and the priests of the Levites, and we see here the total of the ones who were 34 years and upward were 38,000. And 24,000, David says, 2/3 shall have charge of the work of the house of Yahweh, and then he divides them up in other ways. And then finally, as I was noting, in 2 Chronicles, at the very end of 2 Chronicles, and the only reference in the entire book of 2 Chronicles, Josiah said to the Levites who taught all Israel and were holy to Yahweh, put the holy ark in the house that Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, built. So there it settles there, and there's no more need for the Levites to be carrying the ark. So that we see this as an exilic expression from some priestly author, like many scholars think the priestly author of the Genesis story, like Genesis 1, and perhaps that's connected to Chronicles that way, or the post-exilic strain around Ezra and Nehemiah. Either way, this seems to have been inserted into our passage here. So we don't need to worry about that too much, but just to note that this interrupts the text as we've seen it. So returning to our key words and shape for what we're looking at today, we stopped last time in the middle of the center of the chiasm here. So we see this chiasm all the way from verse 13. Someone went to David and framed at the other end. Someone else told David, so indirect speech to David there. And then David leaving on foot. In our scene here, Zadok and Abiathar are carrying the ark back to Jerusalem, so leaving and then going back, at least they're going back. And then speaking to Ittai in the scene we looked at, and then speaking to Zadok in our scene here. So starting in verse 24, the order of the Hebrew is very different than what we see here. And to focus that, I'd like to focus on the note down below where we see the New English translation, the Net Bible, offers this. Zadok and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. When they positioned the Ark of God, Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. But as I note, the word zebach for sacrifice is not in the Hebrew. What's at issue here is the phrase Abiathar came up in the Hebrew is down here, in the space between they set down the ark and in this space. So the Net Bible adds sacrifices as like otherwise what is Abiathar doing there? And the phrase for coming up is often associated with offering sacrifice. But it simply doesn't say that here. The verse in Hebrew starts with Zadok and all the Levites carrying the ark, and they set down the ark, and Abiathar came up until all the people had passed out of the city. So we'd only seen Abiathar and Zadok earlier in 8:17, and there Abiathar is not a priest, as you can see here. Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, was priest. Sariah was secretary, and we don't hear anything about Sariah again. And I noted last time how Benaiah was described as over the mercenary Cherethites and Pelethites, but we don't see him in our immediate scene either. So Abiathar is not called a priest here. We see a couple of verses down in verse 27, Zadok is called a priest, but when I look ahead of that note, we'll see it's not until later in the chapter, and then 4 times total, that Abiathar and Zadok are seen together as priests. So perhaps this is out of some slightly different tradition, or perhaps it's trying to make Zadok parallel, like Ittai was parallel for the sake of shaping the story. It's hard to know. But in any event, we see that the ark is part of the journey here now, the Ark of the Covenant, and it's set down in the city while the people leave, and that's what sets up this conversation here. So as Polzin notes below, David may be stating to Zadok what many Israelites in Babylon hoped in their hearts, noting that he's suggesting this is from an exilic situation here. Bring me back, suggesting bringing back from Absalom. Borgen notes below, echoing in reverse the taking of the ark into battle by Eli's wrongdoing sons, that's in the first chapters of 1 Samuel, Samuel, David refuses to bring the ark along in his flight from traitorous Absalom. And as Frisch finally notes below, through this gesture he proclaims the everlasting sanctity of the city, in marked contrast to Absalom's going off to another town at the start of the story, which was Hebron. But whether David considers Jerusalem the everlasting sanctity or simply his place that has Yahweh's seal of approval on it, you'll have to decide for yourself. So he says to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. Notice like he's supposed to do it himself, although by all descriptions the ark has 4 posts, at least we hear it from Exodus, and would require multiple people to do it. But here it's directed simply to Zadok. To carry the ark back into the city, notice the city twice here, not named as Jerusalem, but simply as the city. And then David suddenly seems to get pious, and yet it's just himself, as we'll note. So let's listen to it, and then we'll hear what's going on. If I find favor in the eyes of Yahweh, he will bring me back and let me see both it and the place where it stays. And the term for place is an unusual word here, Navahu, meaning his pasture, as the note from Landy suggests, an apparently bizarre designation for Jerusalem or the temple. But it suggests back in verse 7-8, the place from which David was taken. As Landry notes, Jerusalem or the sanctuary in its midst is the antithesis of the city, in that sense as a pasture. He also adds, the narrative sets up our expectations in order to disappoint them. With the death of Absalom, there will be no peaceful homecoming to the divine pasture. So an interesting thought there. David imagining it will return in a different way, it's hard to know. So, but then he offers an alternative. But if he says, and as my note below has, and yet there is no consultation between David and Yahweh, narrated at least, nor a word from Yahweh directly. So the supposition that David is offering here to Zadok, if Yahweh says, I take no pleasure in you, how are we supposed to imagine David is anticipating understanding whether he finds favor in the eyes of Yahweh and is being called to bring back, or finds no pleasure, since we see no reference to David ever consulting Yahweh. Instead, he'll consult Hushai and some other human representatives, as we'll see in the coming chapters, but never Yahweh directly. So is this just a pious speech because he's speaking to the priest? It's hard to know, but David certainly, we know, can change his voice and his scene depending upon who he's talking to, as we noted last time in recalling his pretending he was mad before King Achash of the Philistines back in 1 Samuel. So, if I take no pleasure in you, or no delight, and that echoes earlier in 1 Samuel, here I am, let him do what seems good in his eyes. So notice the parallel with eyes, hidden by the new RSV for no particular reason. Either if I feign favor in his eyes, or if I don't, let him do what seems good in his eyes. So he has the sense of Yahweh watching, but not any sense of talking to Yahweh. And Yahweh is not mentioned again, as you can see on the right side of the screen. So it continues here, and as Halberstam and Holmes note, he could use the priest to inform him what was happening in the city while he lingered in the wilderness. And that seems to be the issue here. Not that the priests are engaging in priestly things, but they're staying there in case something happens that they can inform about. Now, if they're in the city and something happens and David's across the Jordan, it's not like they can text him, but we'll see what happens when they appear later in the chapter. So the king also said to the priest, and this is the form, as Bodner notes below, of what scholars call resumptive direct discourse, suggesting he, quote, has quickly formulated a plan. So by the narrative intervention here in David's speaking to Zadok, it's just a moment's gone by and he's come up with an idea. So only here, as Zadok mentioned, as a priest in this scene, otherwise recalled, as I noted at 8:18 earlier, as you see from the note below. And not to Abiathar, just to Zadok. So look here, not the usual Vehenna and behold, but as my note on the right side has, as Ald suggests, it could also be translated, are you a seer, as a question, suggesting the very sense that Zadok might have some vision of what's going to happen in the future here. So it's either just look as an exclamation or are you a seer. Go back to the city in peace, or Beshalom, exactly how David dismissed Absalom to go to Hebron in 15:9. You and Abiathar with your 2 sons, and in the Hebrew, your 2 sons at the end of the verse, which makes more sense. When we read it this way, with your 2 sons, Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar. We read it the other way, Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, you and Abiathar, your 2 sons. So Ahimaaz, your son, who's also the name of Saul's father-in-law that we saw back here in 1 Samuel 14:50, plainly not the same person there. But Jonathan is also a family name for Saul, of course, David's friend who protected him from his father. As Landy notes below, another recollection of David's past of an ideal friendship between the two houses. However, for David, Jonathan is simply an agent. If the Saulite Jonathan sides with David against his father, his successor works to separate Absalom and David and to prevent parricide. And we'll see more of that later. So then David continues, so while you're doing that, while they're going back to the city in peace with your sons, I will wait or linger, impossible to pronounce without the vowels, but it's only here in Samuel. It's twice in Judges in the Deuteronomistic history, a rare word, at the fords of the wilderness. And there's a lot to be paying attention to here. First, let's look at the picture of it. Here's an image of the fords. There's a classic Currier and Ives picture of it. You can also see here from the 19th century of tourists at the fords. As Ald notes below, if the phrase fords of the Jordan are in fact if the fords of the wilderness are in fact the Jordan fords, then the symbolism of this narrative is all the stronger, not just quitting the city of promise, but the land of promise as well. So when we look at the language that's translated this way, we see Be'avroth, Be'arvath. So Avarah for ford and Arava for Jordan Valley. Jordan Valley, though, left out here, and Midbar for wilderness is also in the Hebrew. So notice he simply leaves out the second word, which could easily be, I will wait at the fords of the Jordan, at the wilderness, until word comes from you to inform me. And so when we look at the map and see where we are, we were in Jerusalem, of course, and Ahithophel from Gilo we saw down here. Absalom was made king in Hebron down there, and now we're all the way over to here to the fords of the Jordan, where he's going to wait until words come from you. How that word is going to get from Jerusalem back to them with Abiathar coming is not clear at all. But our scene ends with Zadok and Abiathar carrying out the king's orders, carrying the ark back to Jerusalem, and they remain there. And we'll continue next time as David goes up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.